climate change, and we know that as a result of those environmental challenges, these problems are only likely to get worse. So on today's panel, we're going to discuss this link to sort of see how serious those threats are to farming and to food security, and also talk through what the right policy response should be. The last government did a number of things, not least the transitioning of agricultural payments towards paying farmers to restore nature, to improve their climate resilience, to sequester more carbon, which can form part of the solution, of course. But there are a whole range of other things as well, such as on-farm reservoirs, abstraction, nature-based solutions, potentially even the reintroduction of beavers, if one of the panelists wants to go there. So lots to discuss, and I'm delighted to be joined by an excellent panel. So I'll briefly introduce them now and then call on them each to speak for 3 minutes in turn. Then we'll throw it open to some questions, so please be thinking of anything you'd like to ask our panellists. So first speaking will be George Freeman MP, the Member of Parliament for Mid Norfolk and a member of SEN's Parliamentary Caucus. He most recently served as a Minister of State within the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. Next we'll have Jerome Mayhew MP, a Member of Parliament for Broadland and Fakenham and an active member of the SEN Caucus. He's the Shadow Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for the Department for Business and Trade. Then we'll have Councillor Lizzie Hacking, the Chairman of the Conservative Rural Forum and a Director at Next Gen Tories. Then we'll have Martin Lyons, the CEO of Nature Friendly Farming Network, which advocates for sustainable farming practices that support wildlife, enhance soil health and ensure food security. And then lastly, we'll have Vicki Hurd, the Strategic Lead on Agriculture at the Wildlife Trust. So I'd like to invite George to say some short opening remarks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sam, and thanks for SEN for all you do. Those of you who know Norfolk will know that the word mid means that I'm the bit you drive past on your way to get to the coast and beautiful parts of Norfolk, and you will be also aware that it doesn't have a coastline. And I think Jerome and I are the only two sailing MPs in Norfolk, and neither of us have coastline. He has some Broads. But in praying for water to sail on, I never imagined that I would get what has happened in the last few years. So I'm going to do very quickly, what is the problem, why is it happening, what do we need to do, and what are we doing? So the problem in my part of the world, it's pretty sandy land, it's dry, it's called Breckland. House builders love to build on it because it's pretty easy, and they like to dump houses outside of villages and outside of towns near the roads and then sugar off. And we've seen about 6,000 houses built in mid-Norfolk in the last few years. In 2020, 30 of my villages flooded with sewage coming up through inside people's houses, and I spent Christmas, as with many other people, bucketing out and calling Anglia Water and trying to get people to pump. And then it became very clear that we had a big problem. 2020 was particularly bad, but in the last 3 years it's got worse again. And as you say, this year we had the wettest October on record, November on record, the wettest December on record, the wettest January on record, the wettest February on record, and the wettest March on record. We have a huge problem. And by the way, of course, this is part of a broader framework. In this country, we've done water pretty badly. We run out in the summer, we flood in the winter. To be fair to Anglia Water, they're putting billions into investing in the piping infrastructure, and now we're going to need them to spend a lot more on the drainage infrastructure locally. So in my part of the world, we set up the Mid-Norfolk Flood Partnership, 32 villages. And why is it happening? Well, a bunch of reasons. Yes, it's climate change, overdevelopment on floodplains, lack of proper infrastructure upgrades. So developers build a lovely housing estate, it all looks very shiny, they plug it into the old Victorian drains and sugar off, there's no upgrade, so when it rains, and then we now get high intensity rain, it builds up, it overflows into the sewage system. And there are other problems. The farm management system in Norfolk has changed. Not many family farms own and run their own land. It's contracted out. The contracts don't provide for the same level of maintenance that you used to get on our farm in quiet months. You clear the ditches, do the drains. Some people don't know their riparian rights. A lot of people aren't looking after their ditches properly, and not just or even farmers particularly, but all sorts of landowners. And 36 agencies, that's just in Norfolk, have responsibility for flood, which means nobody has any responsibility for flooding. Everyone's passing the buck. And it's a serious crisis. It's a serious crisis of breakdown of the state. I mean, there are many things that don't work properly, but when you buy a house and you pay your taxes, one of the most basic things you expect, I think, your country to do is to make sure that the water drainage system means that it doesn't flood with your own sewage. And believe me, I've stood with many constituents in tears in their own sewage, and you ain't got anywhere to go when that happens. It is a chronic breakdown of the state. So what are we doing? We've convened the Mid-Norfolk Flood Partnership. That turned into the Norfolk Flood Partnership, led by Norfolk County Council, and we've set up the first Norfolk Flood Summit. bring all the 36 agencies together, not for PR, but to be held to account, to look at a map of where all this flooding has happened. Until the last few years, the Environment Agency came to Norfolk a lot to try and silt up the rivers, silt up the broads, stroke the flowers, and forget that drainage means water getting off the land and out to sea, and flooding has meant Hemsby and the coast. We haven't had enough consideration of the inland flooding problem, and I've drafted a bill, which I'm introducing in Parliament next month. Norfolk is number 6 out of 10 counties, so this is going on all across the country. Somerset had it in spades and wrote their sort of Somerset playbook and changed powers, and my bill basically, it's called the Flooding Prevention (brackets Responsibilities and Liabilities) Bill, and it basically takes powers back down to the internal drainage boards who've been doing this well for 400 years, takes some of the EA's vast budget and allocates it to local flood partnerships, insists on having proper data, puts the Cabinet Office in charge of proper resilience planning, and creates a new duty on developers. If the area that you built in flooded within 5 or 10 years, you're on the hook for the improvements. I think it's the only thing that'll get developers to go, look, while we're here, we better upgrade the drainage. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much. George, yeah, it'd be great to discuss some of the thinking behind that bill and the questions as well. Next, Jerome.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm the Member of Parliament for Broadland and Fakenham, which is also in Norfolk. When you drive through his bit, you get to the really nice bit, which is my bit. It has the Norfolk Broads, but it's also very rural, a lot of farming. Norfolk is the driest county in the country, but it also has a huge amount of surface flooding. And we have a problem with water being obtained. It seems a bit ironic in the current situation, but in normal such circumstances, our farmers are really struggling to get hold of water for irrigation. Historically, we've had water abstraction from our rivers, but also from boreholes. And the Environment Agency is now in the process of removing a large number of water abstraction licenses for farmers. So you think of all those broad acres in Norfolk, they're reliant on water being abstracted from the boreholes. If you can't do that, you're not going to get farming in large parts of Norfolk. So we're having, in the Anton Bure catchment area, river catchment area, for example, there are 42 water abstraction licenses which are in the process of being removed. The answer, according to the Environment Agency, is on-farm reservoirs, and I agree. We get lots of water increasingly in the winter, and then normally we get these droughts in the summer now. So it's obvious, isn't it? You capture the water, the excess water in the winter, all it's doing is making the North Sea a bit less salty, and put it into reservoirs, and then you can use it during the summer. The problem is the same Environment Agency sits on their hands. When you apply for planning permission for a reservoir, it can take literally years to do it. But I think there's a real problem in the Environment Agency. The top speak the right language, but the people who are, there's a middle, and I don't want to point fingers particularly at individuals, but the process takes far too long. And it stops farmers doing what we want them to do. So you've got reservoirs. Another way that Martin in particular is leading in the field in this is regenerative agricultural techniques. The way you treat your soil, you can retain much higher water for longer in your soils. But it works, but it's not the only answer. And there are periods where regenerative agricultural techniques, as we were just talking beforehand, you have to go back to basic heavy metal principles, because we've had so much water in the last 18 months or so, we've right across Norfolk we've got soil slump, which means that it compacts, it collapses, and then you have to be brave enough to get in the subsoiler and build it up again. Okay, I've also been asked to talk about food security. At the moment, we produce about 60% of our food and if we grew everything that we could. So forget the pineapples and the avocados, but if we grew everything we reasonably could in this country, it's estimated we could grow about 75% of our food. And this has become much more salient politically because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the disruption of long supply chains that we've seen over the last couple of years. And yet, if you chuck in the weather, where we are having more variable yields from the land that is under production, I've got a real question mark over this, because we're saying 60% is the base. We want to grow that up to further towards 75%. At the same time as we're removing quite a lot of land from production, in this sort of land sparing rewilding, and yet on the land that we're continuing to produce food on, the yield is less predictable. So there's a challenge there, and I think as environmentalists, we should not shy away from that. We should address it.
Great, thanks, Jerome. Good provocation at the end there as well. Lizzie, next.
Thank you very much. So my family farm in Sussex, actually in quite a big part of marshland. So we're a big producer of cricket-back willow trees, which need loads of flooding in order to be able to grow effectively. So I'm well aware of the challenges of when we can't actually even go near half of our farm because it's underwater. But one of the things that we want to talk about is how we actually get the next generation of farmers to look at environmental policies and fully adopt them. But I just wanted to put into context the massive change that the farming community has seen over the past 50 years or so. If you go back to post-war, everything the government was saying the whole time was about how much food can you produce, and ripping out hedgerows, making massive fields, forget nature, let's throw whatever we can onto the fields and just produce. We've then gone through a massive shift towards the environment, but we've also taken away basic payment schemes. So we're already in a massive period of volatility for farmers. And then now, I think the next huge challenge that we've got to face is the fact that the climate extreme, all the extreme weather is the norm. And so we took DEFRA ministers around the country and held public meetings with different groups of farmers in different counties. And I think the feedback consistently was almost like, oh, this is a bad winter, this is a bad summer, we're worried about this, how are we going to get through? Can we have some support from the government to help us with this particularly bad yield? I actually think this is going to be the norm, so we need to have a massive attitude change and we need to be planning much more for the future. And resilience just needs to be the thread throughout farming for the next generation going forward. But the problem is, I think we've touched on it a little bit, the country doesn't think like that. I saw a fantastic tweet from Simon Clark who said the last time a reservoir was finished in this country, Oasis hadn't signed a record deal. Like, that is pathetic. So how are we then going out and preaching to farmers to be like, oh, well, okay, well, you guys need to be looking at nature-based solutions and sorting things out, when actually the country doesn't seem to be able to follow that through. But if you look at other international examples, so Australia have the sort of farm management deposit scheme, because financial resilience is the key blocker, I think, to farmers actually being able to address this properly. So I'm not saying this would work in the UK, but it's just an example of how they every single year expect either no yield whatsoever because of extreme drought, and basically they look at, so farmers can put money into a government deposit scheme when there is a good year to carry them through. Obviously the farm structures are very different, they're so much bigger, but we need to be looking quite creatively to be able to do that. And in the US they do crop insurance schemes which have all sorts of problems and people scamming them and whatever, so wouldn't recommend, but I think we need to be looking much bigger picture than just how can we subsidise to get you through for the next year and going forwards. So there's obviously quite a lot you can do on a practical level on your farm, which I think Martin will probably come on to talk about shortly, but I just think we need to be looking at conserving water and making sure even like larger downpipes, kind of this basic infrastructure should now just be commonplace, to accept that there may well be a really, really bad year in terms of rain, but there also we need to think about, it's not just moors that have the ability to have wildfires now. So if you're planting lots of trees, we need to be looking, I think, apparently in 2022, in London, the fire brigades had the biggest emergency since the Blitz. So this is very much, we need to be taking this forward across every single part of the country in the way that we think to save ourselves from extreme weather and flooding or drought. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Lizzie. Next, Martin.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry. So we farm in Cambridgeshire, and on our own farm we've been using the environmental schemes for probably 20 years now. But I think it's been a welcome step change in moving away from an area-based payment actually to an action-based payment towards ELM and the SFI schemes. And we've been able to use those to improve soil health, improve drainage within our soil as in infiltration of water, building in resilience into our system. If I can slow the flow of water down and make it actually soak into the soil quicker, and that's what we've been able to do on our own farm by farming our soil better. The heart of our business is our soil health, and there's options that are in the SFI and the ELM schemes incentivise us to put cover crops in, incentivise us to not move so much soil. But if we're farming in a regenerative system, that doesn't mean we don't move soil, it just means you minimise it as much as possible. And as we were saying earlier, this year we've had an extremely wet year. A lot of the bare soil has slumped because of all the weight of water, so that means we've got to do something to lift it up a bit. Roots are amazing things, and worms, but it can't do everything. But be able to use the schemes to actually then look at our ditch management. We can buffer and widen that the edges of the ditches out. We can slow the flow in it. Once we get the water into the ditch, we can slow it down. The trouble is, if I put an obstruction in the ditch, I can get in trouble by the water agencies. You know, and if I want to put some ponds in, I have to get full planning permission. If I fill a pond in, not a problem. And even just putting small ponds, nearly £1,000 worth of planning permissions needed. It's a bit crazy. There's over 600 farms that are waiting to put reservoirs on their farms. There are other farms that are willing to have water storage on their farms during the winter. With the new SFI 24, there was lots of provisions in there, and it was meant to be available from the summer. It's currently not accessible by farmers. We've had one of the worst years on our own farm. It's been a really poor year for yield, and we've just seen 6 inches of rainfall in the last couple of weeks. I'm not sure if we're going to be planting anything this winter. That's the second year, and it's the seasons we're making losses that are the biggest hurt to us. Making money, we can just spend that. When you make a loss, it takes 2 more years to catch that up again, and that's what we're now seeing, the volatility. So if we want food security, we really need to sort of invest in landscapes that can be resilient to weather, and invest in nature restoration and climate mitigation as rapidly as possible. Just funding me as a farmer to produce more, great, but if I can't produce it, how are we going to cope with it? We also need to have a rethink of actually what do we want from our land. 62% of the grain we produce as farmers feeds livestock. If we eat a little bit less meat, I'm not saying stop eating it, but eating a little bit less meat, we can free up some land and we can get this balance right. And in each landscape, there needs to be local choices around what's needed to build a resilient landscape that gives us food security for the future.
Great, thanks very much, Martin. And lastly, Vicki.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Sen, for working with us on this piece of work. We've done a briefing which will be available shortly, and this event. So my name is Vicki Hurd. I'm the Strategic Lead on Agriculture at the Wildlife Trust, which is an organisation which has 47 different charities within a federation. So you can imagine how easy it is to work out what we believe in, what we want to say together. It's quite hard work, but we're all about restoring nature, but also people being involved in nature, and that includes farmers. We have 26 farms on the federation already, over 250, I think, farm advisors and land advisors. So we talk to farmers on a daily basis, and I've worked a lot with these farm advisors, and it's really important work that they do, talking to farmers about what they can do to restore nature within a farming system. We're not all about rewilding. We want more land spared for nature, absolutely. It's absolutely 30% of the land and marine for nature by 2030, but actually I'm interested in the 70% of land that's farmed, and that needs to be farmed better in order to do what Martin was saying, to deliver food for us healthily, but also in ways which create a resilient farming system. And obviously flooding, as I don't need to repeat some of the things, but you know, it's absolutely critical that we get this right. We've all seen what's been happening. It's been a record high of flooding. But part of that is because we've lost a lot of nature, both within the soil, but also around and within the fields. And bringing that nature back is a real opportunity now, because we've got elms, we've got an incredibly live interest from the private sector as well in investing in nature-based solutions. The two of those together with a really solid advisory and training service would create an incredible future for farmers. I think, you know, we talk a lot about innovation and genetic engineering and tech and everything, but actually we've got a lot of the solutions already in farming. As Martin was saying, we know a lot. But a farm which is more flexible and able to deal with these problems because they've built soil strength, soil health much better. We all know that a soil with high organic matter can hold a lot more water. That's been true for, you know, we've known that, the data's there, the evidence is there, so we need to build those food systems. But also we need to build nature-based solutions around and within the landscape, as Martin was saying. So investment by local and national governments, by private investors, to deliver things like more wetlands. We've lost most of our wetlands over the last 100 years. Really, most of them are gone. We need to bring them back because they were brilliant at holding the water when it needs to be held and letting it go when it's needed for people and for farming. Those wetlands and peatlands, lowland peat. We've got a lot of work on peatlands. We're working to stop the extraction of peat. And the last government had a bill ready to do that. It's not done yet. Let's hope it's done. But there's also the lowland peat soils, which are used for agriculture and other purposes. Protecting those soils for being able to re-wet them would create a huge opportunity to both stop greenhouse gas emissions, but also hold the water in those soils and create nature-rich areas. So peatlands, wetlands, re-wigging rivers. There's amazing work being done. I don't know if anybody follows James Rebanks, but he's a wonderful Cumbrian farmer who's re-wigged his river with the help of local wildlife and local schools and communities to make the water go slower and to make the river longer. I love the phrase that farmers use at a wonderful conference that's held every year now called Groundswell, about regenerative farming and agroecological farming. And they say, what we need to do, where the river runs, we need to make it walk. I think that's a lovely phrase, and it's absolutely right. And that can be happening in so many ways, but nature-based solutions in the farm and around the farm are absolutely critical to that. And I've probably missed a few. Wetlands, I've said. And beavers. Beavers, I should have mentioned beavers. We're obviously in favour of a licensing system so we can reintroduce beavers across because they are unbelievable system engineers. And I know people are immediately going to think, what if there are problems? If there are problems, we sort them. We have to remove the beavers if there are really big problems. But let them do what they can do so brilliantly, which is slow, stop water where it's needed, up the stream so it doesn't flood farms and it doesn't flood cities and towns. And alongside that, we need to get beavers, and I understand this government is going to do that, and the Welsh government have just agreed to licence beavers introduction, which is fantastic news. But more trees. Obviously, the last thing I'll say, more trees on farms. And I've been absolutely thrilled that the last government introduced an agroforestry strand of the environmental land management scheme. We were campaigning very hard with the Woodland Trust, Soil Association. Agroforestry is a way of introducing trees in farms, both livestock farms and cereal farms. And I know some wonderful farmers who've been doing this for a decade, and they get all the benefits of soil maintenance, of stopping wind disturbance of the soil, but also the animals in a livestock farm. There's ample evidence show they benefit, and you can get products to sell. Sorry, I probably should stop now, but more trees on farms, more hedgerows, and maintain the wetlands and peatlands.
Great, thanks very much, Vicki, and thank you for taking up the gauntlet on beavers as well for my introduction. Right, I've got a couple of questions that I'm going to put to a few of the panellists, and then I'm going to throw it open to the audience, so please be storing up your questions. Martin, I was going to come to you to see if you had any response to some of the comments that George and Jerome made around on-farm reservoirs and the helpfulness of some of the government agencies, like the Environment Agency, around making it easy for farmers to do the right thing when it comes to protecting the environment and storing more water in a responsible way.
Free us up to get on with stuff. Don't hold us back by long, laborious planning permissions. Actually, get local advice in. If it's the right thing in the right place, unlock it. Let's have trusted advisors if we get the things happening. There are so many farmers actually wanting to get on with this. We need to move water off the land to allow the crops to grow and the soil to be good, but we need to store it in the landscape for when we need to use it for other times.
How about a presumption that a reservoir is a good thing and you should be allowed to get on with it unless there's some reason not to, instead of you have to get permission for everything?
Permitted development, right, in the Sen Farming Manifesto was one of our policy asks, so yeah, very up for that. Jerome and George, I wanted to ask you a bit about the government's farming schemes, particularly the sustainable farming incentive, and maybe to give a bit of a perspective about how your local farmers have found it and whether that could provide some of the solution to some of the issues that we've talked about. George, do you want to kick off?
So I'm really worried about this. I think Jerome may be more optimistic, but we both care about this passionately. We talk about it a lot. Look, I come from a farming family. I'm very old, as is very obvious. I left school and I still have a place at Harper Adams. I was going to go into farming. And I remember my stepfather, who'd been a post-war farmer, saying, I think farming's best days are behind it. I don't think anyone's going to support it as a proper industry. And he was wrong, actually, because I didn't vote for Brexit. I thought it would be a suicide, a sort of civil war-inducing political distraction from the business of growth and recovery. But one of the things I would have voted for if I was to get out of the CAP. We had an opportunity, we still do, not that complicated. You pay the upland farmers to keep it beautiful. You help the small, medium operations to diversify and to do glamping and tenting and cheese and yoghurt and all of that. And the bigger units, particularly in the East, in East Anglia, highly commercial, internationally competitive businesses. We support them with science and technology, and the bit that they can't afford to do generally, support them with the environment. And in the East, we are beginning to do, but wonderful watercourse work, reservoir work, linking up the field margins. And the farmers today are completely different. My stepfather's generation were chemical farmers. They left, post-war, they were taught, this is how you grow high yields, you spray everything. And his son has now taken over, my stepbrother, the family business, completely different. He's a regenerative farmer. They're a wonderful generation. But I look at my patch, and there's some great projects. The Upper Wensum Farmers Group, they're looking at the beautiful Wensum chalk stream. They're looking at for themselves, how can they reduce pig effluent. There's a FWAG advisor. They all put money in to help her. It's really good. Down the road, there's a Wendling Beck, which is a brilliant wetland project, rare species, supported by English Nature. The same day I went to see them, in the afternoon I went to a thing with Tony Juniper, and about 50 people from Natural England, DEFRA, all came up in brand new wellies they'd obviously bought at the garage on the M11. I was talking to the head of Natural England for the East as we walked down, and I said, it's very nice to meet you, important role. You must be, where do you live, in Newmarket? Excuse me. She said, no, I live in Wimbledon. And I said, golly, you must do a lot of miles coming up here. She said, no, I actually haven't been up here before. There were 50 people, and we spent an afternoon walking up to look at a field, which as a farming boy, I'd say, well, you can probably get 1.5 tons of oilseed rape off it. And the finest minds in government were trying to work out how to rewild it. I tell you how you rewild it if you really want to. Just leave it. It'll go back to Breckland grass. So I think what's happened is that the farming community has responded to this challenge far better than I and many of us thought they would do. Really quickly, a new generation is doing it. And I think government, we've failed to give them the security of this framework, particularly in the East, so that you can be a competitive farmer in the field, and there's a clear, simple, reliable framework for support. And all these people walking around with clipboards asking you if you've got the right... We could use satellite imagery to do it. We could use some AI. We could cut out a load of rubbish and give this generation the guarantee that their environmental products will be properly paid for. I worry if we don't, they'll just go back to cultivating up to the edge.
Thanks so much, George. Jerome, do you want to...
Yeah, I
respond
do. George is wrong. So I am a lot more optimistic. I think Elms, we share the view that Elms was absolutely the right decision, moving away from area-based payments. Public money for public goods sounds about right to me. And the farming community, and I can only really speak for the east of England, we tend to be larger farmers, and full disclosure, I'm a director of a farming company as well, so I do have skin in the game. They can I use impolite language? Farmers always bitch and moan, don't they? Have you ever met a happy one? So there's a lot of grumbling about Elms as it was introduced and the phasing of it, but I think the principle was broadly welcomed. And yes, you can say that there wasn't enough funding or the balance between small, medium and large projects wasn't right, but that's work in progress. The actual direction of travel, I think, was absolutely right. And one of the real tragedies of the last election is that, broadly speaking, farmers were getting on board. And now we understand that there's a threat to the Elms budget, that it's not, for all their fine talk about it, Labour don't understand farming, and they are going to, I suspect, cut that budget in real terms and maybe cut it in absolute terms. And what will that do? Just as we're getting mainstream farmers, not true believers like Martin over there, but mainstream farmers like the ones I represent, who are dipping the toe and maybe the ankle into regenerative farming techniques, about sharing their fields with wildlife rather than just trying to keep it up to the edges. All these things are beginning to happen. There's actually, dare I whisper it, an enthusiasm for this in the farming community, albeit with a degree of nervousness. And if we then send a message as a government to say, we don't really care about that and we are going to starve you of funding, then I think the risk is we go backwards. Final point, government should get out of the way at all available opportunities from farmers. Farmers know what they need to do. And we've been talking about reservoirs, but that's just one example. But we know, and I mean, it's bonkers that you can't dig a pond. Why do you need planning permission to dig a pond? You know, why do you need that? We should be getting out the way unless it's required that we need to get involved. Whereas too often bureaucracy sees their role as being involved in everything. And then, you know, once they've gone through a process, taking a lot of time, by the way, time kills deals, and time is often out of phase with grant funding windows as well. They then say, okay, well, we're finally satisfied that there's no issue here. It should be absolutely the other way around. And I'm sorry that over 14 years of a Conservative-led government, we weren't more dynamic on this. We should have been bolder with the reorganisation of quangos. I've always thought that. It was my maiden speech was on quangos and how we need to bring them back under political control. And that will be a key task for the next Conservative government in 4.5 years' time.
Great, thanks so much, Jerome. Right, I'm going to throw it open to some questions. Have we got someone with a microphone at the back? Excellent. Let's start with Ed on the front row, Katie, right hand side.
Thank you. Ed Barker, Head of Policy AIC, also part of a family farming cereal business in Suffolk. Just wanted to bring together Lizzie's point on economic resilience, Jerome's on food security, and Martin's on markets being provided for. In wet and in dry years, it's extremely difficult to meet quality and spec required for the market. My question is, you know, with only 40% of Group 1 wheat drilled last year that went through to actual milling spec, the rest went for for animal feed. My question is, what are the tools that we can use out there to ensure that what's being grown is for human grade spec? Are they agronomic? Are they technological? Does it require a change from the market end? Be interested on your thoughts on that from a wider food security point of view. Thank you.
Great, we'll take a batch of 3 so we can get through a few. So the gentleman here at the front as well.
Hello, Simon Jones from Broadland. Hello, Jerome. This is more a question about strategic thinking. As a government and as MPs, I think you have let the public down by letting this bureaucracy become overreaching and overarching. Just in terms of strategy, we could do vertical farming, which would free up land for rewilding and other projects, but that can't be done at the moment because energy is too expensive. We have the most expensive energy in the world. So it's a question of where is the strategic thinking?
Great, good question. And yeah, the lady here on the second row.
Hello, Sarah Pugh. I'm a West Suffolk District Councillor, so it's an East of England takeover this morning. We are in a patch that has got a lovely carbuncle, or will have soon, called Sunnica. And that is taking prime agricultural land. Ed Miliband rushed that through. It is an issue of planning so often. We also have the Spa-Anglia water pipeline going all the way through all of my district, and they're ripping out hedges because they're a utility and they're allowed to do this. Yes, I sit on planning committees, and yes, it is impossible for you to dig a pond. It is completely bonkers, but so often it's the planning rules, and that's outside of the control of a district or the county. It's, I'm afraid, MPs, it's kind of your problem.
A very good challenge. Right, I'm not going to ask all the panellists to answer all of them because I think otherwise we'll be here for too long. So the first one, Ed's point about the kind of quality impacts as a result of whether how we can drive up the standards of food that is harvested in these wet conditions. Maybe George, would you like to take that one?
Actually, I was gonna leave Ed's and take Simon and Sarah's because I think they're two sides of the same point. The
Go
agronomy
for
one.
it then.
Yeah, so I am. The reason I'm not as happy as Jerome about this, I think we have failed as a Conservative generation, and I think as a farming boy from Suffolk and East Anglia, it pains me that my party, that was a party of agriculture, a party of the countryside, a party that knocked Labour for 6 on this, right? I do think we've let our rural communities and our farming community down. I agree, just for the record, I completely agree with Jerome that the strategy of shifting to support commercial agriculture properly and with science and technology and gene editing and all of that stuff to help them wean off chemical agriculture and embrace new technologies needs to be supported with the environmental support. I just think 7 years after Brexit, the farming community is still waiting for some certainty, and there are far too many civil servants enjoying buying wellies and fiddling and walking up and getting in the way. Government has got far too big in this area, and I observe after 14 painful years in Whitehall on your behalf trying to pull levers that the machine is pretty out of control. And I think that's what the public have worked out at this election. I think it was a rejection of us for failing rather more than a roar for Keir Starmer. I think quite quickly he's going to find he's pulling levers and it's not working. I think we're in a really serious crisis. And to Simon's point, where's the strategic vision? There is no strategic vision in Whitehall for East Anglia or for Norfolk, except that what I think is beginning to come clear to your point is there now is one, which is now that we're making commercial farming very difficult, we're going to build houses, vast numbers of houses out in this agricultural plain of East Anglia, and we're going to cover it with solar farms. I've now got the biggest coming in mid-Norfolk, on top of the 2 substations. And I think they look at East Anglia as a sort of dumping ground for big infrastructure that you couldn't squeeze in elsewhere. And we have got to put forward a very powerful vision with our new Rainbow Coalition of MPs in the East, because otherwise I fear we're going to end up, we'll be sitting here saying Labour had a vision, it was dumping big, heavily subsidised on-land infrastructure in the East, and not taking the very exciting beginnings of Elms and turning the East into a global model for how you combine proper commercial agriculture, regenerative agriculture with great environmental corridors. That's what we should be doing, and I don't think it's where we're now heading.
Great, thanks, George. Maybe bring in Lizzie now. I don't think you'd pick up the second point about bureaucracy being out of control.
Yeah, so I was involved in looking at some of the red tape around elms, because obviously following from Jerome's articulate about farmers complaining slightly, to word it a little bit differently. But basically, a lot of that, just going back to their arm's length bodies, was that, I mean, it was actually embarrassing. So farmers would apply for something, Natural England would say one thing, then they'd fall out with so-and-so, and then they'd actually, well, the EA think it might be triple SI on the edge, so they want to apply this. I mean, and then they would forget to reply to an email, and then, I mean, it was just genuinely quite shameful. So a lot of that has actually got cleared up, and I think the process is now a lot smoother. But one of the areas that I think we haven't touched on so much is looking at government as a whole and inter-department problems. So permitted development rights, I think we all agree, is a really positive thing for farming business. But we had this friction between DEFRA and DLUC in that, oh, well, that's a DEFRA problem, or that's a and actually, I think we need a more strategic approach across the whole of government for the rural economy and to kind of unlock and empower farming and the countryside in particular. I don't think Labour are going to be the ones that are going to do that. It's obviously clearly not a priority for them. They really haven't even, I think there was 87 words in their manifesto about farming. They absolutely do not know what they're talking about, and I think there's been quite a lot of concern following the Labour Party conference. But I think another own goal that we didn't put into place was some sort of land use framework, because loads of the conversations that we've had today have been about the conflict between energy or nature or food production. And fair play, to the civil servants, unless you're going to tell them the direction of where we want to try and get to, well, it's not for them to sort of start prioritising that. So I think we as a party should be looking and kind of setting the direction, setting the goal, and then hopefully, campaigning to make sure Labour take that seriously and don't go off, as they are with Seneca, heavily down one direction that actually, is damaging. We need it to be really carefully considered for the sort of long-term future of the country.
So maybe bring Vicki in on that. Do you have thoughts on the land use framework and whether that would solve the problem of lack of strategic thinking?
Yes, actually, I wanted to come on and sorry, point. But yeah, land use framework, absolutely essential. And I did want to say our Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust have been doing a fantastic project funded by DEFRA for 3 years, getting all the landowners, farmers, community, businesses to engage in a process of discussion and looking at what needs to happen in the land in Hampshire to deliver both those three for many, many things. The multifunctionality of land is beginning to be understood. Land can be multifunctional. It can stop floods. It can produce food. It can restore nature. It can provide livelihoods, and et cetera, et cetera. And that process, I just done a blog on it, actually, and it's really fascinating what they did. What worries me is that DEFRA didn't read the big reports that they produced of it, because the kind of process of a local democratic discussions and engagement is really exciting, and it could and should be part of a land use framework delivery at a local level and local nature recovery. But I did want to say just something about the specifications for supermarkets, because I think it's absolutely critical. We've come to believe that all carrots should be a perfect size and all the bread is absolutely uniform white. You know, there's so many specifications which, with a climate changing as it is, flexibility needs to be built into supply chains. And it's not just about having an ugly fruit line. That's just another specification, that a market standard that farmers have to adhere to. We need to be changing those standards so they're actually fit for the farms of the future, that are nature rich but also producing good food for us. So it should be nutritionally perfect, not perfect size, colour, whatever. Those kind of things, they're in our part of bureaucracy because they're doing government grading as well. So we need to be challenging that. And then finally, I did want to say, I was very pleased to hear Tom Bradshaw saying there's a food system problem we have here, because farmers do need the elms to deliver the public goods, but they also need the market to pay and play fair. We need much better contracts, much fairer pricing, and all the deal that the farmers get from their buyers at the farm gate needs to be improved in order for them to deliver nature-friendly farming.
Thanks, Vicki. And then Jerome, I think you wanted to come in very briefly on...
Yeah, on Simon's point about vertical farms, there absolutely is a brilliant role for vertical farms. I have the world's largest vertical farm in my constituency. They produce the same amount of crops as 1,000 acres. 1,000 acres of broadfield farming on a 4-acre site. Now, if you chuck in the solar panels required to feed it, it's 50 acres of land for 1,000 acres. And I'm going to be slightly controversial here, because you've got one of the best farmers in the east of England sitting at the end there, and he, even with his regenerative agricultural techniques and all the good stuff he's been doing, is unlikely to be able to plant or grow anything this year because of the radical weather we're facing. And if we assume that that is a sign of the future, at least for a period of years, you know, you'll have good years and bad years, we do need, if we go back to food resilience, we do need vertical farms as part of the solution. But that's not you know, fluffy animals in a green field that you're looking at. It's a very different aspect of agriculture which we need to embrace. And the second thing, which we haven't talked about, although I think Lizzie did mention it, is if we're having farming having to deal with significant periods of zero income, we as a society I don't think you can just leave that to the farming industry, because we won't have one. We need to think of ways in which we socialise risk over a period, or we have an insurance-based programme, but we need to start addressing the concept of farms having multi-year periods where they have no income. And as policymakers, I haven't heard anyone talking seriously about that yet.
Yeah, very good point. Next set of questions then. Yes, over here, on the fourth row, on the right-hand side.
Hello, Tom Lester. I actually sat on the land use committee in the House of Lords. It was the first one that was attempted. It was a couple of 3 years ago. And we produced, I was pretty sceptical initially as a Conservative, but it was a consensual report, and actually we produced a good piece of work. Unfortunately, our government watered it down and then did nothing about it. So that's an opportunity lost, because if Labour do something about it, I suspect it'll be radically different and will upset a lot of people. Secondly, Jerome, I'm absolutely with you about reform of the quangos, but realistically, if we were to get in power in 5 or 10 years' time, we're going to need a damn strong leader, and we're going to need a fairly robust set of MPs. But even then, I fear that it'll be really quite difficult to take the power away from these organisations, because effectively, they don't make decisions. They make the wrong decisions, and it's the politicians that get it in the neck, which is terribly sad. On your point about reservoirs, totally agree. The fact that we're not getting planning permission for them, I'm lucky we have a big farming operation in North Norfolk. We have 4 reservoirs, but we are wanting to do a partnership with a couple of other farms and estates, and we cannot start a potato business with them because both of them have been delayed by 2 and 3 years in their applications. And finally, Vicki, just to correct you on wiggling of rivers, we've done one at the River Stiffkey with the Norfolk Rivers Trust. Actually, the water does flow faster. Point is, it's going over about 4, the length of it is lengthened by about 4 times, so the water actually goes faster and scours the bottom of the river.
Not been done very well then.
I won't say anything about beavers.
There are ways of doing it well.
Thanks so much, Lord Leicester, for continuing our East of England takeover. On the second row, the gentleman there.
Thank you, Brett of Builders Merchants Federation. Like Jerome, can I be controversial? Because I think Conservative MPs and Conservative governments need to look in the mirror. I remind you, we used to have a very, very good farm business extension service called ADAS. I know, I worked for it. And so the questions of the East Anglian cabinet ministers, I remind you, John McGregor, Gillian Shepherd, John Gummer himself, privatised it under pressure from Cluttons and others. You've then invented Natural England. I know I recommended Paul Christensen, the Oxfordshire farmer, to be its first chairman. The Natural England we started with then and the Natural England we've got now are wholly different beasts. So I throw back in the Conservative government's face. You started this. You had a perfectly good system called ADAS. Now, again, as Lord Leicester has said, it's going to be difficult, but if you're going to do it, you're going to have to do it again.
Do you want to just pass the microphone to the right? Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. My name's Cllr. I'm from Humane Society International, animal welfare organisation. Wanted to just talk about the elephant, or perhaps the sort of cow in the room of a lot of the farming conversations at conference, and that's the rise in the number of mega farms in the UK. They're a sort of US import. We now have got about 1,100 mega farms in the UK. I think Cranswick has got planning permission for 2 more farms in Norfolk, housing 48,000 pigs each year and 7 million chickens. And these are obviously enormously challenging in terms of environmental impacts, pollution, use colossal amounts of water, terrible for animal welfare, as well as hugely unpopular with local communities. So it feels like the efforts of Martin and his colleagues, for nature-friendly, regenerative farmers are really dwarfed and undermined by the rise, largely unchallenged, in these mega farms. So we'd like to see the growth of these mega farms stop. My question is, does the panel agree? And if so, how do we challenge and stop this trend?
Great, thank you very much. I might start with Martin. I don't know whether you want to pick up some of Lord Leicester's points about the importance of a land use framework and what the new government might do and what you hope that will be in their land use framework when it appears.
I think it's a real shame that we haven't had one already that set the direction and the overarching of what we can achieve, and then let the local decision makers do. Labour are talking of consultating starting in November. We don't actually know what they'll come out with, and where will they take a rural voice in how that works. Hopefully it'll be a top line of sort of where the areas of opportunities are, where the areas of need is, and then make local decision makers act on it. We can't get down to drawing lines on maps because everyone decides we're one side of the line or the other. We need to look at areas of opportunity, and that will unlock that conversation of where do we find the right balance we do in the landscape. It shouldn't be one or the other. It's how do we stack enterprises and opportunities and drive a rural economy through benefits of what we can do in the landscape.
Great. I might now turn to George and to pick up maybe the first and the second questions.
Yeah, well, if we can group the first two, and I will touch on megafarms. The reason I have been saying the things I have is that as Tom and the other gentlemen here have both said, I do feel as though we've made a lot of progress, but after 14 years, call it 8 years since the big Brexit reform, I think we have left this ecosystem in a mess. The flooding is testament to the lack of long-term thinking And that's where I think the House of Lords has got a very big role to play. Parliament is not a great place to do anything that goes beyond 5 years. I think actually the upper chamber could do a lot of good in thinking about this. I mean, the post-CAP agricultural policy needed to be a 40-year framework. It needed to look at Britain in the world, outside of the CAP, and it's not that complicated. And I think we have allowed a lot of green quangocrats in DEFRA to indulge their fantasies about how they can create new schemes and come up with new... There hasn't been a clarity of vision of what we really want to achieve, and you can't really blame the civil servants if there isn't a strong, clear land use policy and a clear policy for how you combine commercial agriculture with good environmental quality. And this generation have shown, people like Martin have shown, it's perfectly possible. And on the ADAS point, I'm old enough to remember the ADAS. The man from, it was sometimes a woman, normally a man from ADAS came around and we'd put his burrow in the tilth and look at the seedlings. I'd love to shift this framework to giving farmers basically the voucher, the entitlement to get the support they need, and allow farmers and land users to purchase the advice and the support they need, and to support the FWAGs and the good ADAS people, instead of this vast bureaucratic machine in London, which commands and control and sends out diktats and countermands instructions. I think we could create a framework that's much more local. I think we could use technology, we could use satellite tracking to do field margins, we could use some AI to do all the compliance. We could come up with something much quicker, cheaper, faster, and more locally relevant.
Lizzie, I don't know if you wanted to come in on either the mega farms or maybe Natural England and ADAS as well.
Yeah, I think it goes back again. I'm just going to make it slightly more political in how I approach this. We are having a bit of an identity crisis, I think, as a party when it comes to the countryside. So on the one hand, we're saying food security is really, really important. But obviously, the reality of that is mega farms are more productive, and obviously there are negatives to that style of farming. Equally, we say we're going to be really pro-business, but in order for farmers to be able to afford to do sort of gentle stocking, etc., then actually you have to have other streams of revenue to come in to support that. So is that the way we're going to go? Do we want subsidies to be able to help us with the environmental side? So I think these are the political conversations that we all need to be having from all wings of the party. Going back, I suppose, to the land use framework, actually, politically, what do we stand for in this space? Because Labour are not going to be like the biggest advocates of the countryside. It's a real political opportunity for us, but I think we need to just have some clarity and maybe unite the parliamentary party in the direction that we want to be taking this forward.
Jerome?
Yeah, okay, so on the land use framework, I'm nervous about it. I mean, politically, it's an absolute time bomb. DEFRA had a land use framework, was going to be announced in 2023, and we sat on it. And the reason why that was sat on, I don't think this is totally controversial to say, is because of the political time bomb of the gentleman from Whitehall telling you what you can do with your farm or your land. I mean, it has, yes, conceptually, a land use framework from a national basis is very useful for all the reasons we've been discussing. But when it's your farm or your village and they said you've been earmarked for solar panels, you're not going to love it. So as a Conservative, I believe in localism. I believe in our communities having as much control as possible over what happens in our communities. And then I'm just going to switch over a little bit to the Environment Agency bashing, which we've all been enjoying very much this morning. There is a difference between... I don't want this conversation to be an us and them conversation. It should be a we conversation. I don't want to say that the Environment Agency is being captured by the green lobby, although in elements I think it has. What we need to be having is an Environment Agency which is a facilitator for farmers. Farmers want to look after the environment. They want to leave their farms in a better condition than when they bought them or inherited them. And the Environment Agency needs to be a we organisation, not a them organisation. And I think there's two issues there. One is bureaucracy, running a good organisation which is lean and responsive and dynamic. It isn't that, and it should be. The second one is the concept, the attitude. Who is it that they see as the enemy? And if they see the farmers as the enemy, then they've got a fundamental problem with their attitude.
Can I just come to the mega farm point, because I think it is quite important, and I think it's a very loaded term, mega farm, and probably deliberately. It's designed to conjure up an image of vast factory farms of cruelty. I think there are huge issues about whether, as a society, we're going to continue to want to need to eat cheap meat. And if people want to be able to go into a supermarket, my hard-pressed, low-income mid-Norfolk constituents go in and buy sausages they can afford and chicken they can afford, and we talk about food security, then we've encouraged, companies like Cranswick are doing just that, and they're, it's free-range pigs. I'm very proud we were the country that banned sow stalls. These are not battery hens, they're free-range. It's an operation that is really providing what the customer says they want. I think there are huge issues about water and about labour and about land, I agree, but I worry at the term mega farm because I think it's deliberately designed to conjure up some sort of Orwellian vision of animals screaming in pain. These are not. Some of the best welfare standards are in these well-run units. Some of the worst welfare standards are in some of the smallest, least well-run, least capitalised farms that aren't viable. So I accept there are big planning issues, but I don't want to demonise companies that are producing high-quality food at a price that most of our constituents rely on.
Vicki, do you want to come in?
Yes, I mean, the issue of food security has come up a few times, and whenever I hear this, I always want to say, well, we waste 35% of the food that we produce. We put 130,000 hectares into biofuels to burn in cars, and we put, as Martin said, a huge amount of food into livestock. And pigs and poultry are some of the biggest users of our grain and our protein from South America, which is destroying rainforests and the very important pantanal. All these things must be part of the equation, as well as the animal welfare standards. But also, I think we've got to be careful about the nutrients. The nutrients, they're really valuable nutrients. And when you're not having a system which is circular, that the animals are part of a farm system where the manure is part of regenerating the soil and providing nutrients instead of the artificially produced fertilizers, which are hugely bad for greenhouse gas emissions, then we're losing it. And the kind of farm that you were talking about there is so not part of an integrated system, an integrated livestock system with the farming, that the load of toxic manure that will produce has to go somewhere. And we've known this for 35 years that I've been working in farming. In the Netherlands, they had this huge debate about this in the 90s and said, we've got to have the land on which to put the manure. We haven't got this right yet, and we've really got to. Because with more flooding, those problems with our rivers, which we know very well from the River Wye, and it's not just the River Wye that has a toxic overload from the pigs and poultry farms, which are deliberately sited in that area because there's a processing plant nearby. We've got to get this right, and I don't think that's the solution. We should have local authorities' power to say no to those kind of huge outlets, which we don't need more protein, more cheap protein. I'm going to say it'd be controversial. We actually eat too much protein. We need to eat less and better meat and more fruit and vegetables.
And actually, the demographics suggest that meat consumption is falling pretty fast, and that in 20, 30 years, people will probably be saying, you were all worried about providing cheap pork and cheap poultry, and there'll be a huge range of new synthetic proteins coming, there's artificial meats coming, and I think the diets are going more vegetarian. But for the next 20, 30 years, this is an issue.
Well, I'm very conscious we've slightly run over, unfortunately, so I'm sorry that we've not been able to get to more questions. And I was also going to pose a question to ask everyone what their favourite nature-based solution to flooding would have been. So imagine your answer to that.
Beavers.
And there we go. We've got a quick-fire answers for you all. But yeah, very conscious that other people have to get out to other events. So yeah, I'd just like to flag our next event, Pastures New, which is taking place in half an hour in this room. I'd like to thank our sponsors for this event, Wildlife Trust. As Vicki said, we're also doing this briefing on flooding and drought and food security as well, so please watch out for that. And I'd like to thank our speakers as well for giving it their time. I'm very grateful. And thank you all for coming.
Encourage people to work with it. I mean, there's no difference.